What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today I wanted to have a really good look at bullet velocity in Modern Warfare, mainly focused around Warzone, because this is something I looked into a little bit really early on in this game's life cycle, but it was just for multiplayer and it just involved multiplayer ranges. But now with Warzone, we're often fighting at much longer distances, and this is why I wanted to revisit this topic. So what I did here is I selected a small handful of guns. Keep in mind, I didn't test every single gun in the game because I quite simply don't have the time to be doing that, and that's outside of the scope of this video. But the first two guns that I chose are going to be the AK-47 and the CR56 AMAX, and part of this is due to the fact that I created a versus video putting these two side by side recently, and a lot of people were saying I should have mentioned bullet velocity because one does have a faster bullet velocity than the other, so I included those two. Then I also wanted to use the Grau and also compare the base Grau versus the Grau with the Archangel barrel, because the Grau with the Archangel barrel is extremely common in Warzone, and I wanted to see what kind of a difference there is between using the base Grau and that longest barrel. And then finally, for the regular full auto guns, I wanted to have a look at the Bruin, because this is becoming the #1 gun in Warzone at the moment. And with this one, I wanted to look at two of its different barrels and how those affect the bullet velocity. So it might seem like kind of a random assortment of guns, but I think this is a good representation. We're choosing guns that may be used at longer ranges where bullet velocity really matters, and it wouldn't make as much sense choosing an inaccurate SMG, for instance, and trying to find its bullet velocity at 150 meters, where you would never be using that gun anyway. So what I did for my tests is I did all my testing in a LAN environment, so there's no network delays or anything along those lines, and I tested at 4 different distances: 50 meters, 75 meters, 100 meters, and 150 meters. And at each of these ranges for each one of the guns, I did a 5-round test, and then I found the average amount of time it takes for the bullet to reach the target. And keep in mind, all of this was measured on console at 60 FPS because the vast majority of the player base plays on console at 60 FPS. And also, to my knowledge at least, the client-side update rate is still 60 Hz, even if you're playing at a higher frame rate. The game itself is only processing that data at maximum 60 Hz. So let's hop into it and start it off with the 50-meter distance here. You can see with the AK-47, it takes 3 frames for the shot to register, and it's the same thing with the CR56 AMAX. And it's worth noting that the AK-47 is supposed to have a noticeably higher bullet velocity, but you just don't see that difference at 50 meters. Then with the base Grau, it takes 2 frames at 50 meters, whereas with the Archangel barrel, this was a very surprising result, but I consistently replicated this as well. This wasn't just a weird one-off test or something. The Archangel barrel actually takes significantly longer to reach the target than the base Grau at 50 meters. So I don't know what is going on with that, but just wait until we get to the other ranges and you can start to see the benefits of using the Archangel at longer ranges. But then moving on to the base Bruin, this took 2 frames, which is very solid. The Bruin with the 23-inch barrel took 3 frames, so it was actually a little bit slower, even though this is supposed to increase your bullet velocity. And I got the exact same results with the 26.8-inch barrel, which is supposed to give you even more of a bullet velocity boost. But again, it actually took longer to reach the target. So there is something really weird going on at about 50 meters, or 0 to 50 meters, where the barrels that increase bullet velocity seem to actually decrease your bullet velocity, but only in those close range encounters. So I don't know how everything is coded here, but something's a little bit off there for sure, and it's not my testing method. But moving on to 75 meters, going back to the AK versus the CR56, you can see now we start to notice a bit of a difference here. The AK-47 still hits in just 3 frames, same as 50 meters, whereas with the AMAX, on average, it takes 5 frames for it to reach the target. So you do start to notice that discrepancy at about 75 meters or so. Then when it comes to the base Grau, this is 3 frames, so a little bit slower than 50 meters, just like you'd expect. And with the Archangel barrel, it seems to kind of cross over here, and it also takes 3 frames at 75 meters, which is faster than the 50-meter range. Which, again, this makes absolutely no sense. It's like this barrel slows the bullet down at first, and then it accelerates beyond 50 meters for some weird reason. But getting into the Bruin, this is significantly slowed down at 75 meters compared to 50. It's now 5 frames. Then with the 23-inch barrel and the 26-inch barrel, both of these are still 3 frames for the bullet to reach the target. So at about 75 meters, this is where you start to see the benefit of the added bullet velocity with the barrels on the Bruin. But moving on to our 100-meter range, you can see with the AK-47, it takes 5 frames to reach the target, so it is starting to slow down a little bit at this point. And the CR56 AMAX now takes 8 frames to reach the target, and this is where it really starts to become noticeable. 8 frames is quite a long time in Call of Duty terms. and therefore the base AMAX without any barrels that improve bullet velocity is not really all that viable beyond 100 meters. But moving on to the Grau, the base Grau is going to take 5 frames to reach the target, whereas the Archangel is going to be a little bit better at 4 frames. Not significantly better though, it's worth noting, which is kind of surprising. Then with the Bruin, it still takes 5 frames just like the 75 meter range at 100 meters with no attachments equipped. As for the 23-inch barrel, this was 5 frames on average as well, so no real improvement here. But for some strange reason, this is where the 26.8-inch barrel really stands out, and it takes just 2 frames on average to reach the target, which is faster than 50 meters and 75 meters. So just like with the Archangel barrel, it's like there's some weird acceleration that happens after a certain distance where it actually performs better than it does up close. And again, keep in mind, this is an average. This isn't just a one-off test. But finally, we have 150 meters, which is about the maximum clean line of sight I can get on custom games, so on the multiplayer maps. But at 150 meters, the AK-47 really starts to slow down here. It now takes 9 frames to reach the target with no barrel equipped, whereas the AMAX is now up to 12 frames, and this is practically unusable at this point, especially against any target that is moving. You're basically just taking a wild guess and shooting in the general direction with the AMAX at that point. But then looking at the Grau, it's the same as the AK-47 at 9 frames at 150 meters. Whereas with the Archangel barrel, this keeps it down to 6 frames, which is still pretty slow, but it is noticeably better than the base Grau at that point. Finally, looking at the Bruin here, we see the same story as the AMAX. It takes 12 frames at 150 meters to reach the target, which is practically unusable. However, with the 23-inch barrel, we can cut that down to 9 frames, which still isn't great. And then with the 26.8-inch barrel, it does cut it down to 6 frames, which is somewhat manageable, but still fairly slow. Honestly, beyond 150 meters with all of these guns anyway, I don't really see myself challenging an enemy in Warzone, just because I know that I'm generally not likely to be able to finish those kills, even if I can manage to land a bunch of shots. So yeah, taking a look at all of this before we look at one of the sniper rifles, I was very surprised to see that up close, the longer barrels seem to actually have a slight negative impact on your bullet velocity. It's also worth noting that from 0 to 50 meters with assault rifles and LMGs at least, bullet velocity on the base weapons appears to be basically irrelevant. And this is why in regular multiplayer, most of your gunfights are going to fall within 50 meters, and therefore you don't really have to worry too much about bullet velocity in regular multiplayer. Once you start getting beyond 50 meters though, this is where bullet velocity does start to come into play a little bit more, but it's mainly that 100-meter point. That's the big turning point where bullet velocity really starts to matter, I find. So for those people that really like challenging people at super long ranges with assault rifles or LMGs in Warzone, like beyond 100 meters, yeah, bullet velocity is a very important stat that you definitely want to keep in mind when building your loadouts. You want to go for those longest barrels possible. The monolithic suppressor also adds a little bit of bullet velocity, so it's nice to add that on top of it. And if you do this, it'll make a big difference at those extreme ranges. However, for a lot of people, myself included, I'm not going to be using these guns typically beyond 100 meters. And therefore, for me at least, I consider attachments that help with bullet velocity to be a nice bonus rather than something that I really need to focus heavily on and rely on. And this was fairly surprising to me. I think a lot of people put way too much focus on the bullet velocity of weapons because for the majority of their gunfights, it doesn't really matter, or it might matter by 1 frame at 60 FPS, which isn't really that much of a difference, especially considering the fact that with my tests, there was a bit of variance even in a land environment. Sometimes the variance between my tests would be about 2 frames. So really, from 0 to 100 meters, as long as you're not actively using attachments that reduce your bullet velocity, I would say it's not something you have to worry too much about. But for those people that are really trying to maximize the effectiveness of their super pinpoint accurate Grau or Bruin that is designed to be basically used as a sniper rifle for really long ranges, absolutely stack up heavy on those bullet velocity attachments. It's going to make a huge difference for you in those very long range fights. But with that, there's one last thing I wanted to have a look at and point out that I found to be quite interesting myself. I wanted to test the AX50 bullet velocity because that's my preferred sniper rifle in Warzone, and I wanted to see if there was much of a difference between the base AX50, the SimGuard Arms Pro barrel, which is my preferred barrel with the AX50, and then finally the 32-inch barrel, because I've had a lot of people lately telling me that I should be using the 32-inch barrel on this rather than the SimGuard Arms Pro barrel that I use, because it's got significantly better bullet velocity. So I once again did my tests here at 150 meters, which, like I said, that's about the longest distance I can get a nice clean line of sight in the multiplayer maps anyway. And I was quite surprised to find that they were very consistently hitting on the exact same frame, regardless of the barrel I was using, or regardless of whether or not I was even using a barrel attachment. There is no difference in bullet velocity out to 150 meters with these barrels. Now, if we were to stretch this out to 300 meters, yeah, we would probably start to notice a bit of a difference here. But I did find it pretty surprising that all the way out to 150 meters, there wasn't any detectable change whatsoever with the barrels when it comes to bullet velocity. But yeah, that pretty much covers it for today's video on bullet velocity and how it affects various guns within Warzone. I was personally surprised by some of these results, and I'd like to hear from you guys in the comment section below. Did any of these results surprise you as well? Like the longer barrels actually taking longer to hit the target up close compared to at a distance? And will this video change how you build your class setups? Just let me know those thoughts in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.